Welcome everyone. Bonjour tout le monde. Welcome to the 12th epac webinar, the fourth one of 2018. And we're extremely pleased to have Dr. Ralph Heintzman as our guest speaker today. I'll wait just a few more moments. We have the majority of the registrants have already tuned in. I'll leave it for one more minute and then we'll get started. So welcome again, bienvenue à cet webinaire Through the Looking Glass, Public Sector Ethics Now and Beyond, au travers du miroir, éthique du secteur public aujourd'hui et au-delà. We chose this topic because we had a very successful conference in May that looked back at the origins of the sorts of ethical underpinnings in the public service of Canada nowadays that date back to 1996. And so this is a way of continuing the discussion with Dr. Ralph Heintzman, who is one of the main speakers on that occasion. I'm your host. My name is Robert Czerny. I was the head of epac for approximately the last 5 years. And since half a year ago, I am Dr. Craig Irvin has taken over. I'd like to invite you to participate, of course, in English, mais aussi en français si vous voulez. Monsieur Heintzman est totalement confortable en français, et moi je pourrais traduire les questions ou aider à la discussion si c'est nécessaire. Please use your phone line or the computer audio, and I'll have all of the voice lines from participants muted all the time, unless you so-called raise your hand to request speaking privilege. And that just helps to keep out the noises of dogs barking and traffic outside your cubicle or whatever it happens to be. You can also send written messages in the question box, and you can send those at any time. And I'll either pick them up for discussion if it's appropriate at that moment, or I'll hold them for later on when we have the fully open discussion period. And I'd just like to let you know that this webinar will be recorded and eventually be put up on our website. Most of you are familiar with our organization, and I hope that you will consider becoming a member if you are not already a member. So I just want to present Ralph Heintzman. He was vice chair of the group of deputy ministers that put out the report called A Strong Foundation, a report on ethics and values in the public service, something like that. I know that the full name is on the last slide. So he was vice chair of that working group, helped a great deal with the writing of the report, and this all launched the current era of values and ethics in the federal public service. Après cette période, il était le directeur du Bureau des valeurs et de l'éthique de la fonction publique au fédéral. And as I said before, he presented at the May 2018 conference. His biography contains other involvements as well, academically and otherwise. And for example, he commented in June on the different views of the Auditor General and the head of the Privy Council on the Phoenix system problems. So he continues to have a great interest in this domain. So now I'd like to turn it over to Ralph. As I said, I'll be keeping track if you've got questions or wish to speak at any time. And if it's relevant, we'll pick that up at that moment, or I'll keep the questions for later. I expect Ralph will speak for approximately 20 minutes, barring those sorts of digressions. So Ralph, thank you very, very much for participating in this, more than participating, being essential to it happening. And over to you.
Thank you very much, Bob. Let me begin by thanking you and EPAC for inviting me to participate in this webinar as a follow-up to your conference on the Tate report last June, or last May. I thought the idea of looking back to the future was a good one at that time, and I think the conference more or less proved that it was, and I think it still is, for reasons that I'll come back to at the end of what I have to say. So I think a follow-up discussion about the conference and about the future seems like a really good idea. On the first slide that Bob's put up on your screen, I've noted some of the themes that struck me during the May conference. You will no doubt have your own list of things that struck you or that you thought were important in that day and in that discussion. And I hope that you will make a point of mentioning some of them before when we get into the discussion period after these few remarks. Since you can read what's on your screen, I'm not going to repeat it all, but I will draw attention in particular to Anne Fraser's presentation on the CFIA model, which I thought was one of the highlights of the day and a model that other organizations can and should build on, and I'll come back to that. I'd also underline Catherine McQuarrie's eloquent plea for a much greater awareness of the Indigenous peoples in the federal public service culture and practice. I thought that was a very high moment of our discussion in May. Turning to the present, if Bob can move us on, I'd just like to remind you that since 2000, the federal public service has implemented, as Bob mentioned, many of the, or at least some of the specific recommendations of the Tate report, or partially implemented or temporarily implemented them, including many pieces of what the Tate report called an ethics regime. I won't go through all of those again. But at the same time, in that same period, we witnessed, unfortunately, some of the lowest points in recent history for public service values and ethics, and for the whole concept of a professional, nonpartisan public service dedicated to the public interest. I won't go into the details of that again either. We can come back to it if anyone wants to, but the key point I want to underline again is that for public service values and ethics, the period since 2000 has been, in a sense, the best of times and the worst of times at the same time. So where are we now? Are we closer to the ideal set out on the left-hand side of the pairs of questions on this slide? Or are we closer to the right-hand side? I'm not going to answer that question. I prefer to hear from you who presumably are either members or in some way or other observers of the public service today, what you think. On the last point, however, the very last bullet point, I just note that in the original version of TBS's management accountability framework, the framework that it uses to assess the performance of departments, when that framework was established a decade ago, values and ethics was one of the foundations of the whole framework. 10 years later, it's been downgraded to a sub-element in people management. A big step backward, in my view, and one that needs to be repaired in any future versions of the map, though I'm not holding my breath on that. However, you answered the question that I just posed, are we closer to the left or closer to the right at the moment? And I hope you'll tell us what you think. I think there's a need to shift the emphasis in the whole field of public service values and ethics from some of the focus that we've had over the past 2 decades. And on this slide, I've suggested some of the ways in which I think the emphasis may need to shift. And since you can read those bullet points, I don't need to mention them all. We can come back to any of them that strike you as important in the discussion period. But I do want to underline specifically the 3rd bullet point, with the shift that I think needs to take place from a focus on individuals to a focus on organizations. Instruments like the code, disclosure regimes, training, orientation, and so on, were inevitably focused on the individual public servant. But the behavior of individuals usually reflects the culture of the organization that they work in. So in future, I think that the public service needs a stronger focus, even stronger than it is now, on organizations, on organizational performance, and organizational results in values and ethics. As the last point on the slide suggests, I also think the public service needs to root public service values and ethics more clearly and strongly in its role as a public service in support of parliamentary democracy, something we sometimes lose from sight. This calls, I think, for what I will call a both-and approach, not an either-or approach to values and ethics. It needs to be both top-down and bottom-up. It should be both soft and hard. It should be both qualitative and quantitative, and it should pay attention to process and infrastructure, but it also needs to pay a lot of attention to real outcomes and results. So let me say a word about some of those. First of all, I think there needs to be a top-down approach because tone at the top plays such an important role in any organization, and it certainly does in the public service. The example and role models of senior leaders, such as, in our case, deputy ministers and the clerk, cascades down through the public service, shaping its values and its ethical culture. So I think there needs to be a really strong focus on what senior leaders do. Not just what they say, but what they do. And on their accountability for real and, I think, desirably measurable organizational results in values and ethics specifically, and in related areas such as employee engagement and workplace well-being, which are closely related to values and ethics, a point I'll come back to. In my view, this calls for some major new infrastructure at the top of the Public Service of Canada and in the legal framework of the public service. And that is because the current extreme centralization of the public service under the leadership of the clerk has, I think, a largely negative influence on the culture of the public service, and especially on its capacity for truth-telling, or speaking truth to power, as we say. It helps to create a culture of what Donald Savoy calls court government. That is to say, a culture in which public officials sometimes, perhaps more often than we would wish, behave more like place-seeking courtiers than truth-telling officials. So to create a healthier public service culture, I've proposed 3 reforms, and I'm not going to go into any great detail of them here because I've written so much about them, including in that Globe and Mail piece that Bob referred to, but I'll just mention them. I think, first of all, we need a new appointment process for deputy ministers, a more arm's length or independent process in which the clerk does not play a role, and I've suggested that that could be a role for a revamped public service commission. As in New Zealand and in the UK. Second, to strengthen the ability and the obligation of deputy ministers to speak truth to power more regularly and more openly, I believe that the deputy minister role as accounting officer, as currently defined under the Federal Accountability Act, needs to be brought much more into line with its British model. I won't go into the details, but I'd be glad to talk about it in discussion. Essentially, I think the FedAA in this area is fraud. It used the name of the accounting officer without actually giving deputy ministers either the tools or the obligations that should go with that role. And thirdly, I think we need a new framework legislation for the public service along the lines of the Charter of Public Service recommended by the Gomery Commission and promised in the Public Servants Disclosure Protection Act. And in my view, that charter should include both the two reforms I've already mentioned, as well as other things such as new rules for government communications and a statement of values and ethics of a professional, nonpartisan public service as a pillar of parliamentary democracy that could serve as a three-way moral contract between the public service, ministers, and Parliament. So that's a brief look at some of the top-down stuff that I think is necessary. But while I think there's some critical new focus and infrastructure that we need at the top, I think we also need to work from the bottom up, or the public service does, I shouldn't say we. I think it needs to liberate the voice of the ordinary public servant and make it count in a number of critical public service processes. The public service can use every ordinary public servant, and this applies to every organization, by the way, for those of you who are in other kinds of organizations, as a key witness of what's really happening in the public service, a witness of the real condition of public service values and ethics in everyday life. And it can do this by building on instruments like the Public Service Employees Survey to develop public service values and ethics surveys and other forms of upward feedback at various levels, at the public service level, at the organizational level, and very important, at the work unit level. And by using this kind of information to develop values and ethics results and performance measures. By incorporating those kinds of measures into all key processes, including managerial selection processes, performance management processes, especially, but not exclusively, for senior leaders and managers in the public service. So what this means, I think, is that the public service needs to give renewed attention to things that have notoriously in the past been considered soft issues or soft factors, but are nevertheless some of the key drivers of the real condition of public service values and ethics. Soft things like the quality of leadership, the kinds of role models and examples that managers and senior leaders give, the way they manage people, the degree of employee engagement and workplace well-being in our organizations, and the organizational cultures that all of those soft things create. But while we give renewed attention to some of those soft things, we can't neglect the hard stuff either. In fact, I think the public service can and must turn many of these soft things into hard things, into hard measures for which leaders and managers can be held accountable. And while doing that, it also needs to give continued attention to some of what I will call the harder preventive measures, including appropriate control systems. We can't do without them. Rigorous risk assessment processes, regulations and rules where they're required, and they are required, and appropriate disclosure regimes and procedures. Those hard things continue to be just as important as the soft things that we need to pay attention to. In other words, in my view, we need an approach that's both qualitative and quantitative. And wherever possible, the public service should develop appropriate quantitative measures for qualitative values and ethics results. And those results should have weight in all the key processes that I mentioned before, and especially in accountability. Accountability of individuals and accountability of organizations, and that means, among other things, the management accountability framework. And I think that's the critical missing piece in public service values and ethics. That is to say, real hard accountability for the soft results of public service values and ethics. I also think that the public service as a whole, public service organizations, and values and ethics professionals should work on developing strong links between values and ethics and other closely related things that I already mentioned, such as employee engagement and employee engagement measures. The two are strongly linked, and so are their indicators and results, both positive and negative. The strongest influences on values and ethics, as I already said, are organizational culture and ethical climate, i.e., what we do around here. That's what governs people's conduct, what they see other people do around them. So understanding and working on the drivers of employee engagement is just as important as doing the same for the drivers of values and ethics explicitly. And the next slide I've thrown here simply illustrates that point visually. The powerful impact of organizational culture and climate on the condition of values and ethics, on the actual behavior of people in the workplace. And it shows why working on the factors that influence the workplace, such as those soft things I mentioned, leadership and so on, are so important.
Ralph, could I ask you to just wait for a second here? Rather than ask you to explain this slide, I'll try to explain it, and then you tell me if I got it right. And that way we'll help everybody else. If we go to the two extremes, then the zero at the bottom says among those people who noticed none of the negative environmental factors, 37% of those people might say that they had observed at least one form of misconduct in the last 12 months. But if people noticed one negative factor, or two, or three, all the way up to 5, if there are 5 negative factors at work, then almost everyone, 98%, would have seen at least one form of misconduct in the last 12 months. So if you're trying to hit the trifecta, don't stop there, go for all 5, and your chances are you'll be 100% in trouble. Is that correct?
That's right. The more negative the workplace becomes, the more wrongdoing proliferates.
Right. Yeah.
And the reverse. The better the workplace is, the better people's ethical conduct turns out to be.
Now, the next slide is, in effect, an application of that thought.
Indeed. And in her presentation in last May, Anne Fraser showed a version of this slide, and I still think it's a framework that's critical to help the public service and public organizations and public service values and ethics professionals make the shift that I talked about from individuals to organizational performance and from principles to results. To get there, we need to be conscious of and working on the kinds of drivers of actual values and ethics performance that are set out here. Both the softer kind at the top and the harder kind at the bottom, both of which shape and influence the overall factor or influence of organizational culture. But to get there, to get to the kinds of organizations that we want, we need to be able to turn those drivers, the ones that are shown in that slide, into results measures. And that's what this kind of framework that I've put on the next slide attempts to do. Every one of the cells in this kind of results framework needs to be populated with an appropriate performance measure for your organization. Measures both for process on the left-hand side, i.e., do we have the right kind of infrastructure? Are we doing, have we made the right kinds of things available to our employees? But also for actual observable behavioral results on the right-hand side. The different levels, level 1, 2, 3 in this framework allows for a progressive excellence or a maturity model dimension to a results framework of this kind. And although I haven't yet seen it, Anne told us in May that the Public Service Interdepartmental Values and Ethics Network has developed a maturity model using this kind of framework. So if you're a member of the network, maybe you can say something about this later. If you aren't a member, I suggest you try to get hold of the network model to see how it could be implemented in your own organization or in your client organization. And Bob, I think a session on the Interdepartmental Network's maturity model might well be a good subject for a future EPAC webinar, or maybe even for a future conference.
Thank you.
But even if you develop that kind of results framework, you have to do something with it. And the next slide points out that successful organizations don't just develop results frameworks, they embed them in a regular annual results management cycle, which includes some or all of the steps and elements that I've mentioned here and others as well. The basic, simple idea is that you need to establish a baseline, establish targets, and an improvement plan based on the drivers of performance, based on the things that will actually change the performance, and report as regularly as you can on the progress that you're making. And then start all over again the next year. That's what best practice, in my view, organizations do, some of which we have in our own public service, but many more elsewhere. And some of the best that I've seen make all the results public in the organization, including the employee's assessment of senior management and the CEO, or in our case, that would be the deputy minister. But for real improvements, one of the most important elements in this, in these bullet points that I've got on this slide that I underlined for you, is using the data to identify the individual work units that are risk areas, so that you can focus attention on making progress there. The problem when you roll up results in any large organization is that the averages start to average out. And so you normally get a kind of an average result for your organization, which hides the fact that you've got some places where the results are well below average. And if you really want to bring up the overall performance of your organization, you've got to have the data to identify those and be able to work on them. Interestingly, many of the things I've been talking about for the last few minutes are actually some of the forgotten themes of the Tate report. Some of the stuff that people have don't remember were in it, and in particular, its emphasis on leadership and culture rather than rules and codes, and its emphasis on measurement and accountability, especially for senior leaders. So I think that, in a sense, confirms EPAC's wisdom in labeling last May's conference Back to the Future. Of course, the Tate report is better known for defining and explaining what a good public servant ought to be, articulating a vision of the public service that public servants could invest themselves in and try to live up to. And I think if we're going to recover some of the ground that we may have lost since 2000, that's something I hope you'll have your views on. It needs to return. the Public Service of Canada, and maybe other organizations too, need to return to both, to those forgotten themes of leadership, accountability, and measurement, but also to the idea of a motivating vision of a professional, nonpartisan public service. In order to give you a sense of that inspiring vision, I'm going to leave you again on my last slide, as I did in May, with the final words of the Tate report. You can read it now more easily on your computer screen than you could on the big screen last May. But I think this is the kind of vision and values in which public servants can invest themselves and seek to live up to in their real lives. And I think that aspiration is what will make the difference for the Public Service of Canada or any other organization.
Well, I'll leave that up for a few more seconds and then turn to our next slide, which is in fact our invitation to everyone online to start adding their comments and posing their questions. And here we go. So please either hit the little button which asks me to unmute your phone or your audio connection, and you can pose your question or add your comment in person by voice, or you can write it in the question box and send it, and I'll notice that, and I'll read it out for Ralph and for the other participants. It's absolutely not necessary to give your name if you don't feel like doing that. So please go ahead and start this interactive part of our webinar. Alors, veuillez lever la main pour parler ou écrire à la boîte de questions et ne pas donner votre nom si vous ne voulez pas faire. Okay? And I'll wait a few seconds to get the first input of that sort, and if not, then I'll start asking my questions. So there we go.
Over to you, Bob.
Well, one of the things that we did while organizing this webinar was to ask some people what they thought the main present challenges are, and there was talk about changes in the demographics of the public service, so that people had different ideas than they would have had in the 80s and 90s when you and the rest of that group did your work. And at the same time, that's dovetailed with new social media. Back in the 80s, we were scarcely getting out of the era when a computer was something that filled a large room. And now, of course, nearly every individual has multiple electronic devices, and the way that information that can have a real influence, that gets disseminated and collected and interpreted and applied, seems to be quite different. So what are your thoughts on the changing demographics and the expectations and use with new media?
I think that's a really good question, Bob. I think those two things are closely linked, and in a sense, one can give a similar type of answer, or there isn't an answer, a view. Other people will have other views, but I can say what my view is, and it's similar for both of those issues. And to come at both of them, I have found that it's important to make a distinction between different types of values and ethics. I like to think of or I sometimes talk when I'm faced with this type of question with what I call the continuum of values and ethics. And at one end of that continuum, you have individual values and ethics. Each one of us carries around our own ethos, our own ideas of what's important and isn't important, what we would do and what we wouldn't do, what's permissible and what isn't permissible. At the other end of the continuum, you have, in a sense, societal values and ethics. what is the general temper of the times in a particular society or time and place. And those may not be the same. You may have, the society may have a set of values and ethics or moving in a direction which you as an individual don't subscribe to or have grave doubts about. So there can be tensions between individual and societal. And somewhere in the middle between the two ends of that continuum, we have what we would call, I will call organizational values and ethics. Every organization or community or association or college or club has its own organizational culture, its own values and ethics. The behaviors that are considered appropriate or inappropriate for that organization. And again, there can be tensions. There can be tensions between the individual and the organization. There can be tensions between the organization and the society. An organization may have a set of values that is not completely aligned with either the values of individuals outside the organization, or maybe even within the organization, or with the society. And I think you have to bring that kind of framework to think about the sorts of questions you raise, because in a sense, you're talking about the way in which individual values and ethics and individual behaviors will now interact with the organizational values and ethics, and whether the organizational should now be influenced by the fact that individual behaviors and perhaps societal behaviors are changing. My own view on that, but I would be interested to hear what the other participants think, is that there are going to be growing tensions between public service values and ethics and individual values and ethics, and I think societal values and ethics. That is to say, professional, non-partisan public service in parliamentary democracy requires us to behave and think and have principles that are not necessarily the same as many individuals or indeed the society as a whole, as it's evolving. And I think those tensions have grown and are possibly likely to grow. And I think the two areas that you're talking about are will reflect that. My own view is that many young people coming into the public service will experience a growing tension between the values of their demographic and the values of the organization. They will experience a growing tension between what they're used to doing on social media and what is now appropriate for them as a public servant. And frankly, my own view, subject to the debate and discussion we will no doubt have with the other participants, is that it's the individual that's going to, in this case, needs to give way to the public service. That the ethos of the public service requires behaviors that may not fit with as easily as they did in the past with the natural ethos of new demographic groups or indeed new technologies.
Thank you, Ralph. We have several questions to get to now, so here's the first one. And it takes us to some of your slides on hard and soft. Are there examples of organizations that you know of that embed ethics or values system-wide and make these metrics part of regular performance reviews? Perhaps you could concentrate on the second part, the embedding of values and ethics into regular performance review. Are you aware of?
The ones that I have seen in the public service, that our public service that does this, goes as far as I've seen it go, would be the Department of Defense, which has quite an impressive values and ethics assessment cycle. And I would venture to say, in the light of what Anne told us, the Canadian Food Inspection Agency. But you can point to many other organizations that do this for other areas, or more generally, if you like, not specifically for values and ethics. There are many public and private organizations that make the soft results a critical part of performance reviews for their senior executives. The TELUS organization, for example, has fired senior leaders because they weren't getting adequate results in their people leadership. The Public Services of Ontario, the Public Service of British Columbia, have gone quite a long way down the road towards measurement of developing workplace indicators, but also making managers and leaders accountable for workplace results. And BC is one of the places I'd point to where they can drill down to the lowest level work units in order to identify where the hotspots that really need to be corrected.
Well, thank you. That's our next 6 webinars that you've helped us sketch out. So now here we go. Here's another one. I assume this person doesn't mind being named because she starts, "Hi, Ralph." So it's Catherine McQuarrie asking, early in your presentation, you talked about the need for a variety of shifts to be made, including from an overemphasis on ethics to values. How would you propose to help make that shift, given how much the whole subject has been caught up in questions of wrongdoing and criminality rather than professional performance?
Oh, Catherine, you would ask the hard question, wouldn't you?
and your answer will determine whether or not you get a Nobel Prize. So enjoy.
Well, I don't know that I've got a really good question answer on the top of my head, Catherine, but essentially the point I'm trying to make there is that ethics focuses on what's the right thing to do. And often, unfortunately, in our systems, what's the wrong thing to do? It focuses on trying to catch the wrongdoer or report the wrongdoer or disclose the wrongdoer. And I think we need to, that's the Kantian question, if you like. I think we need to return to the Aristotelian question, which is what's the right thing to be? If public servants are good public servants, then the dilemmas about what's the right thing to do will not arise so much. So that's where I guess the whole second part of my presentation was, in a sense, trying to answer that question. How do we get people to actually be different people, to behave in different ways? And I think it's by focusing less on rules and codes and things like that, important though they are, and much more on workplace factors, much more on role modeling, and choosing people who are good role models, assessing whether they are good role models, assessing whether they create organizations that are good places to work in. I think all of those factors will help to shape the kinds of people that we are, and then we will not need to worry as much about whether we're doing the right thing.
Good. Well, thank you very much. J'ai une question ici en français, mais aussi la main est levée. Marjolaine, I'm unmuting your line.
Do you hear me?
Yes, we do.
Okay. My question is more about truth telling in the organization. I've noticed that like in some organization, it is encouraged. They encourage their employees to lie. Like something easy like check is in the mail when you know that it's not even done, or when you work for fonction publique, that sometimes you have to make decisions which are not logical, but they're more political, and they often do not make sense for the employees to follow these orders. So I was, like sometimes I feel that that type of culture like makes people to se désengager, for the organization or for the public service. And what can we do about it? Because sometimes we're at the bottom of the line, and there's not that much that we can do about it. How can we make a difference? And help our employees to be more engaged or whatever.
How can we counter this tendency, I suppose,
of truth?
Sorry. Yes, go ahead.
Like we always the organization might have value that says we want to be loyal. We want like customer service is important, but in reality, it's not true. So it's like sometimes it's an important factor which makes the employees sometimes feel that they don't want to engage in that organization.
While Ralph thinks once, I'll just summarize and say that organizations may espouse very positive values, but then the employees realize that they not actually to apply those, but rather to apply quite different values.
Mm-hmm.
So what can be done?
Well, this is obviously a big challenge for any organization. I mean, there are management experts like Chris Argyris who've devoted books to the whole question of the disparity between the espoused values in an organization and the actual lived values of that organization. On the question of truth-telling, I mean, I think it is a critical core value, and not just value, it's a critical core activity for a public service. You cannot have a good public service that cannot speak truth to itself. And we've seen lots of examples of that recently. More than one report, both the Auditor General and another consultant report, have identified the inability to tell truth in the public service of Canada as the major failing that led to the Phoenix fiasco. So if we needed to have an example of how important truth-telling is for organizations, that's la pièce de résistance right there.
And it costs a lot of money.
It costs a lot of money not to tell the truth. So what can we do about it? My own view is that you have to do what I've suggested in my presentation. You have to work from the top down and the bottom up. The top down is we need more truth tellers at the top. We need people at the top who demonstrate through their example that they value truth telling, that they want people to speak to them as honestly as possible. Now, we're not qui veut faire l'ange fait la bête. We cannot expect people to be angels. There will always be margins within which we are not truth tellers, but it's always one of our objectives. And so we need to work from the top to encourage, to create the environments in which we have senior leaders that give an example of truth telling. That's one of the reasons why I've suggested we need some major structural reforms at the top of our public service, because I think that the culture of the senior public service does not encourage truth telling, and Phoenix is the example A of that. But at the same time, we need to work from the bottom up. We need to liberate the voice of the public servant. So those frontline service deliverers that you're talking about, who experience a discomfort or think that they are experience a discomfort in not being able to speak the truth as they would wish to do, need to have the opportunity to be able to say that. We need to have the instruments, the processes, the surveys, the upward feedback that allows that perception to become a reality that needs to be worked on. If we have a critical mass of public servants in a service delivery area that do not believe that they can speak truth, then they will not be delivering good service. And that's a performance issue. However, I shouldn't go on too long on this, Bob, but just before I close, one other point. I think we need to be very careful as public servants when we think that because we have priorities or a language that comes to us from the political level, that we are somehow being unfaithful to our own values and ethics. Very important for us as public servants to remember that our number one family of values is the democratic values. We work for a democracy. The only raison d'etre of a public service is to serve a parliamentary democracy. We are not the people who get to decide on the public interest, thank God. That gets to be decided through a democratic process. And our job is to support that democratic process. One of the reasons why the democratic values appear in the Tate report and subsequently in codes of values and ethics in the way they do is because when we were doing the Tate exercise, John went around to the front lines of the public service, and he often heard frontline public servants saying to him, "Oh, those darn politicians, they're just telling us that we have to do this, and of course we know that that's wrong, that we should be doing something else. If only we were free of these politicians, we could deliver good government." And he was deeply concerned, and rightly concerned, that public servants were forgetting what their role is. Their role is to implement decisions democratically taken. And so we need to be careful if we ever find ourselves saying, "Oh, I'm not doing the right thing because it's the political thing." There may be occasions when to do the political thing is the wrong thing, but by and large, when we're carrying out the democratic will of the people of Canada, we're doing the right thing.
Thank you, Ralph. That's an interesting, elaborate response to that question. I'd like to bring you back to the slide where you mentioned something about the MAP, the Management Accountability Framework. And you, I think, lamented the fact that values and ethics focus now appears as a subset of people management, of human resources management in the MAF. My own reaction is to say, well, if it's there, then what is not emphasized? And a deputy minister and an ADM and so forth would have to also pay attention to the handling of money, the handling of evidence from research and from interactions with citizen clients, would have to be accountable for the formulation of policy and of program design based on evidence and so forth. So
they would have to deliver services to the citizens of Canada.
So I guess my loaded question, are you lamenting that because those other priorities, in a sense, are removed from a values and ethics microscope, that the handling of money, the provision of service, and the other things that we just mentioned and more could be added, that those things are indeed of extremely high importance, but don't need to be as inspected from a values and ethics viewpoint? And just to take the obvious example, let's not use values and ethics when we think about handling money. Was that Was that an answer disguised as a question?
That was a loaded question, and I agree with your load. I think downgrading values and ethics the way they have been in the map is wrong, both conceptually and operationally. Conceptually, because as you just said, values and ethics are a part of everything that a public service does. It's part of service delivery, it's part of financial management, it's part of public policy development, and so on. Operationally, I think it's also wrong, because when a deputy minister thinks about the performance framework for his department or her department, values and ethics should be one of the headlines. It shouldn't be part of the small print.
Okay, thank you. There's another fairly long question, which I'm going to read as quickly as I can and still be understandable. You've mentioned several times, there's a few words missing here. Bear with me. You've mentioned several times something could be characterized as, something that could be characterized as the role of institutions on actors in them, and how problems in the culture and leadership of these institutions have created fiascos such as Phoenix. Without using the word, whistleblowing has also been implied, something that isn't working well in exposing or correcting ethical breaches. Do you think it's just a question of culture and leadership? Or could there also be some structural, institutional barriers to truth-telling and whistleblowing? Often, for example, loyalty to the minister is cited as a reason for reprisal against whistleblowers. Okay, loyalty to the minister. Or is that just a red herring?
Well, I think I'll call it disclosure of wrongdoing. I think the disclosure of wrongdoing is an extremely important part of any ethics regime. That is to say, you need to have it. I happen to be one of those who think that we have actually a pretty good regime in the federal public service, and that it's working pretty well. One of the problems in this area is over expectation. You cannot expect a whistleblowing or disclosure regime to do everything for you. It's a limited tool, and moreover, some of the ways in which we think about whistleblowing leads us down avenues that are actually antithetical to public service properly conceived, or the proper values and ethics of public service. For example, there are whistleblowing advocates that would like to have much greater free speech for public service. I think FAIR actually uses that term, public service free speech. Well, my view is that that's actually incompatible with a professional public service devoted to the public interest. And that's why you have to have good, effective, internal disclosure regimes that allow public servants to report things that are real wrongdoings or real breaches, gross breaches of the values and ethics code. I think we have that in place. One of the things that disappoints people is that many of the things that get reported as wrongdoing don't actually turn out to be wrongdoing. But that is actually a reality in disclosure regimes everywhere. People have a little piece of the picture that they think may involve a wrongdoing, and when it's properly investigated, it turns out that it isn't the case. So inevitably that creates certain kinds of disappointments. But yes, I think whistleblowing is important. No, I don't think it should have, we should invest too much hope or expectations in it.
I'm going to go to the last slide, just because some people will definitely have to quit at 1 o'clock as we scheduled this. So please either use this question box or send an email afterwards to rate the webinar, tell us how we could improve, and suggest topics that should be covered in the future. And learn more about EPAC if you're not a member yet, and consider doing so and becoming a member. I'd like to thank Ralph very, very much for everyone still on the line and for your presentation, and I'll continue on with a few more questions because I think you can still stay for a bit. But for everybody else who has to quit now, whenever you do, thank you very much for attending, and really pleased that we've managed to continue our webinars 4 per year, and hope to continue this practice in the future. I noticed that we had some participants from Alberta in this, so as well as people from other parts of the country in the Eastern time zone. So I think the practice of us making ourselves available and encouraging networking and learning about ethics through this means is proving successful. Thanks again, Ralph.
Pleasure, Ralph.
So here's another question. It follows up on some of the remarks before. Are there any other facets of the Phoenix fiasco that you could comment on? Not, of course, the technical breakdown, but the ethics of the government's response to it, which seems to suggest to the questioner some degree of a lack of caring for its own employees and a dearth of concern for accountability.
I'm not close to this issue, so I can't comment with any detailed knowledge of the case. I have only followed it from a distance, as other people have. I would hesitate to attribute the failings to a lack of compassion on the part of the senior people. I assume that they're human beings like we are, and capable of feeling for the people affected by this. It does raise issues, it seems to me, about the competence of our senior management. If we're unable to solve this problem over such a long period of time, it does really raise some fundamental questions, it seems to me, about the competence, but not necessarily the ethics of the people, at least to the degree that I've been able to observe them. On the question of accountability, this is a very vexed question. Arthur Kruger used to say that people don't think there's accountability unless there are people hanging from the lampposts. His point was, you don't need to draw and quarter people just in order to have accountability, but we would like to have people publicly flayed. It would make us all feel a bit better. One of the difficulties with that in large organizations and in the public service is that it is so hard to pinpoint some single person as being the individual responsible for a fiasco of this size. There have been many senior managers in this file. They have all moved on after having managed bits and pieces of it. In fact, if this points to anything, one of the things that it might point to is the failures of our employment regime, which encourages so much churn in the public service. If you look at the history, it would seem like the managers responsible for this file have changed about every 6 months. And it's hard to run a very good railway if the people in charge are in a revolving door, coming in and out as quickly as they have, or going off into retirement. But it's very difficult to find a specific person responsible, and even if we could, what kinds of public punishments is it that we would want to put them through in order for us to feel that we really have a strong accountability regime? I'm not sure that we need to look to that.
Okay, my rejoinder would be that I don't think the questioner was asking about punishments, but about the accountability per se.
But isn't that, in a sense, what the accountability question is getting at? Is, have we seen anybody pay the price?
Yeah. Okay. Well, I can't I can't expand on that. I wanted to ask you a little bit more about the accounting officer concept. Could you expand it just a minute on that? The deputy minister as someone who's not an accountant, but somebody who has to render account of for the department.
Yes, I can. The accounting officer concept is one that was developed in the UK. It goes back to the mid-19th century. And essentially, its origin was a desire to make the permanent secretary personally accountable for not exceeding the funds allocated to the department. And this was not an accountability they'd received from the minister. It was a personal accountability. And in fact, in the mid-19th century, I gather, some permanent secretaries even had to go to the extent of making up out of their own private purse an over-expenditure of funds in the department. So that originated a process whereby in the UK public service, the permanent secretary signs the accounts of the department and takes personal responsibility for the accuracy of the accounts. That led over time to a convention in the British public service whereby the permanent secretary would appear before the Public Accounts Committee to, in a sense, on their own hook, not on behalf of their minister, but on their own hook, take accountability and responsibility for the management and financial propriety of their department. Eventually, onto that accounting officer convention was grafted a number of other conventions. I think beginning in the 1920s, the UK Treasury instructed the deputy minister as accounting officer that if a minister proposed to do an action that was not in keeping with propriety, the permanent secretary was to request that the minister give written instruction so that it would be clear that the accountability was passing from the accounting officer to the minister. In other words, if the accounting officer was not prepared to take personal responsibility for it, they had to ensure that there was a written document through which the responsibility was passing to the minister for the action that was not in keeping with propriety. And that direction letter was then to be filed automatically with the Treasury and with the Public Accounts Committee. Over time, that accounting officer convention was expanded beyond just the accounts, so that now the accounting officer in Britain has quite a broad instruction that in any situation where a minister is proposing a course of action or is ordering action to be taken by the department, that the permanent secretary is not prepared personally to defend before the Public Accounts Committee. They're to ask for a direction letter from their minister, and that then becomes in a sense, a public document, so that we know the two key points in the accounting officer convention are A, the deputy minister is instructed by the Treasury in any case where they're not prepared to take personal responsibility to ask for a direction letter. So they're A, instructed, and B, they have a tool. They have a tool of asking for the direction letter. Now, we know in the UK that in most cases where a direction letter is requested, it's never sent. So the very action of saying, Minister, I'm not sure we could do that unless you gave us personal instruction, takes care of the matter. There is never heard of again. But in some cases, and many of them are quite anodyne, that is to say, there will be quite routine reasons why a permanent secretary might ask for a direction letter. For example, I can remember is that a certain piece of legislation was coming into effect 6 months later. There was a desire within the government to start doing something under the paying benefits in advance of the legislation. The deputy minister didn't think that he could do that because he was subject to law, was quite happy to do it, but didn't think he could do it, asked for a direction letter so that it was clear that the minister was taking responsibility for, in a sense, anticipating the legislation. This isn't a wrongdoing. It's simply a transferring of accountability from the permanent secretary to the minister. When we had the sponsorship scandal, there was a great deal of discussion in Parliament about what we could do in future about making sure that the sponsorships wouldn't occur. And one of the things that was raised as a possible solution was designating our deputy ministers as accounting officers, so that they would be in the same position as permanent secretaries in the UK and would be able to have both the same instruction and the same tools. So in the Fed AA, we did actually designate deputy ministers as accounting officers, but we failed to either give them the instruction or to give them the tool. So the portions in the Fed AA on the accounting officer are, as I've said in print, a fraud. They used the name, but did not give us the substance. So what I'm arguing is, yes, we do need the accounting officer convention in Canada. It would be a very powerful tool for deputy ministers. For one thing, it would be one of those mechanisms that would get them into the habit of speaking truth to power. If you're under instruction that you must, in any circumstance where you're not prepared to take personal responsibility for an action, you must ask for the minister to give you written instruction. That makes you think about speaking truth to power. I have to be honest with my deputy minister. Minister, you may think this is a good idea, but I'm not prepared to go out there in public and defend it for you. So I'm going to need a direction letter. I think it would be a powerful device for all kinds of reasons, including the prevention of certain kinds of wrongdoing. But it would also be a powerful device for evolving the culture of the public service, developing a stronger culture of truth-telling at the top of our public service.
Well, thank you very much. That was a wonderful discourse on that topic. We still have 5 people on the line. Does anybody on the line wish to raise your hand to join in this discussion? I'll keep watching for that. In the meantime, I do have one other smaller question on the maturity model, which I'll go back to here. You talked about the maturity model being part of this slide, level 1, level 2, level 3. Do you have an example just to help me understand that better? Of
what a maturity model is?
Well, could you fill in three adjacent cells on something?
I'm not sure I could off the top of my head, but the basic idea, and there are many examples of this type of thing. Many quality awards are structured along this way. That is to say, they have a kind of a beginner level, a mid-level, and then a high performer level.
Right.
And the basic notion here is that, say, for organizational culture, you'd have a type of indicator, and each organization would have to decide what that might be, that would indicate You know, are we doing fairly well in this area? But you can't think about that absolutely, because this is a journey. It might be a perfectly good result if you've just started to implement a values and ethics regime. That might be a very good result, and you'd be able to say, yeah, I'm doing fine. But if you've been doing this for a while, it's not good enough anymore. So that's when you need your level 2 and your level 3, so that you can look on excellence as a journey, not a you haven't arrived. You haven't arrived.
Yeah.
And there's still some distance to go.
Right.
And I think it would be a darn good idea, Bob, if you invited the Interdepartmental Network to make a presentation on their version of this model.
Right. Okay. So
originally, it started from the question in my mind: how would you know a good values and ethics organization if you stumbled upon it?
That's a good one. Listen, we have one further comment from our friend who also presented in May. He says, apologies for the errors in my question. I accidentally hit send before editing, and that your answer hit upon 2 areas of his research, and he'd like to join, get together with you to talk about these things further. I'll give you the details afterwards. Thank you, everybody on the line, and I'll bring this now to a close. Bye-bye.